Chapter 91 Unable to Prove. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph did the math and realized there was only a month left before the tax bill passed and the registration deadline hit. To take down the president of the High Court in that short time, they'd have to play dirty. The phrase play dirty immediately made him think of the police intelligence department, so he signaled to Iman, get Fouché over here. Then he remembered he was supposed to be at the police academy for tactical command class. Scratch that. Get the car ready. I'll go myself. A few hours later, 3 carriages rolled out of the Palace of Versailles and into Paris. As soon as they crossed the Seine, Joseph spotted a huge wooden sign on the east side of the bridge, bigger than 2 men, with a giant oil painting on it. The painting showed a beautiful woman in a fancy dress, holding a small glass bottle, sitting in a cozy, elegant home, looking happy and content. Above the painting, in huge letters, was the message, "Forget Christmas gifts this year, ladies." Below that, in smaller print, Guyfile Health Solutions huge Christmas sale. Get a free gift box. A little further down the road, 2 young guys in flashy clothes were waving flyers and shouting, "Buy Paris Angel Cosmetics, and get a 20% off coupon for Gifily Healthcare Liquid when you spend 50 livres or more." Joseph nodded to himself. Manager Brent was earning his keep. He may have given him the initial marketing idea, but for an 18th century guy to grasp it so well and put it into action made him a business genius. He should consider giving him a bigger bonus. Before long, the carriage pulled up to the police information office. Joseph walked straight into Fouché's office and asked, "What dirt do we have on Vezinier that we can use to arrest him?" The intelligence chief clearly knew his stuff. Without hesitation, he said, his first year as a judge in Paris, he took bribes to award the Antoine brothers' inheritance to their uncle. The next year, in a case where a nobleman's carriage hit someone, the victim was found to have deliberately spooked the horse, and only received 50 livres compensation. It should have been more. The same year, in the Camille home invasion murder case, evidence against the murderer vanished from the court evidence room, and the murderer was acquitted. Word is, the murderer's uncle slipped the judge 8,000 livres. 2 years later, the Saddle Street murder case, the murderer, a nobleman, bribed. He went on, and Joseph frowned. Since becoming a judge, Vezinier had been a non-stop bribery and injustice machine. Joseph cut him off. "So, can I send someone to arrest him right now?" "Well." Fouché hesitated, "I'm afraid not." "Why not?" "What he's done is enough to hang him 10 times over." Fouché said awkwardly, "These cases have, at best, scattered records, or just what Mr. Marat told me. No hard evidence has surfaced yet." Joseph frowned, but then relaxed. Vezinier was a lawyer himself and would have been careful to destroy any incriminating evidence. He held out his hand to Fouché. "Give me everything you have on this guy. Let's see if there's anything I can use." "Yes, Your Highness." Soon, a stack of documents almost 2 feet high landed on the table in front of Joseph. The police intelligence department had clearly been working overtime. Joseph picked up the top document and opened it. It contained Vezinier's basic information. Henri-François Migny de Vezinier, 56 years old, 5 feet tall, weight. At age 33, he took over his father's position as a judge in Grenoble and was elected as a local judge. These judges were amazing. They could perfectly combine the hereditary system with the electoral system, getting elected to positions they inherited from their fathers. 6 years later, he transferred to the Paris High Court. At age 51, he won the election and became president of the High Court. Personal property. Interests. Favorite food. Frequently visited places. Everything was listed in detail. It was unlikely even Vezinier's parents or wife knew him this well. Joseph picked up the next document, which covered the court president's social connections. Political allies, Duke Aiguillon, Count Serrier. Political opponents. Close friends, Dossier, judge of the Paris High Court, 49 years old. Verrières, assistant to the municipal commissioner of Caen, 51 years old. Casual friends. Enemies. The following documents detailed Vezanier's home life, including the layout of his house and information about his coachman, gardener, cook, maid, etc. What surprised Joseph most was a special note on this document. Vezanier's 2 living room maids had been taken care of by young men sent by Fouché. Now, the 2 girls were wrapped around the fingers of their handsome, romantic, and wealthy boyfriends. They could even tell you how many times Vezanier yawned each day. Joseph held his forehead and smiled wryly. Fouché was going a little overboard. He'd stoop to anything, even seducing maids, to get information. He set down those documents and picked up a thick stack of letters. These were all Vezanier's personal letters from recent years. Fouché took the opportunity to brag. Your Highness, half of these came from the Black Room, and the rest were copied directly from Vezanier's study. The Black Room was the postal spy unit of the secret police, responsible for checking all sorts of letters. It was the secret police's most efficient department. Even so, the Black Room couldn't compete with Fouché's maid tactics. They must have swiped the letters right from his study. Joseph asked, is there any usable evidence in these letters? Fouché shook his head. Anything that could prove his guilt has probably been destroyed. Joseph had no choice but to open the last document, which was also the most extensive, containing information on all the cases Vezanier had handled. Fouché added, Your Highness, these were taken directly from the High Court archives and are absolutely reliable. Joseph nodded and started flipping through. The first one was a property division case. Nearing the end of the trial, the second case was a rape and murder, and the trial had only started a couple of weeks ago. The story went that a young nobleman named Runake got the urge and kidnapped a 15-year-old girl into his oil painting shop and raped her. The girl's 9-year-old brother followed her to the shop, banged on the door, and yelled for help. In desperation, Runake dragged the boy inside and killed him. Then, worried that the whole thing would be exposed, he killed the girl and dumped her body in the Seine. Because several of the deceased's belongings were found in Runacher's shop, and a neighbor saw the boy enter the oil painting shop, Runacher was quickly arrested and charged. Joseph couldn't help but sigh, feeling sorry for the 2 siblings. According to the case file, the case had already been tried once, but a verdict hadn't been reached yet. Chapter 92 My cousin is here. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph read Vezanier's case file from cover to cover, then spent ages hashing it out with Fouché and the others. But he just couldn't find an angle. They could dig into some of the details, maybe unearth something, but that would take forever. Just when everyone was stumped, Iman popped in, reminding him in a low voice, Your Highness, if you don't get going, you'll miss your classes at the police academy. Joseph rubbed his temples. Looked like cracking. Vezanier would have to wait. He might as well head to the command department first. He got up, heading for the door, then turned back, telling Fouché to keep digging while he was gone. Fouché grabbed a stack of files on Vezanier and hurried after him. But a few steps in, the papers slipped, scattering letters everywhere. Fouché, looking awkward, set the documents down and called for help picking them up. Joseph glanced at the mess and waved it off. Forget it. There's nothing useful in there anyway. He sighed, shaking his head in frustration. If only there were a smoking gun in one of these. He stopped dead, struck by an idea. What if instead of finding evidence, he could trick Vezanier into creating some? He quickly replayed the case in his mind, then spun around, grabbed a few documents from Fouché's pile, and spread them on the table. One was Versailles' file. Then he pulled up the info on Runake's father, the guy behind the recent murder. The 2 cases seemed totally unrelated, except for one thing. Both men were from Ken. Joseph put his head down and thought. Maybe he could use this tiny connection as leverage, nudge things in a certain direction, then, no matter how careful Vezanier was, he'd walk right into the trap. He snatched up the file on Vezanier's maid and reread it. Fouché, he said, his voice buzzing with excitement, you got anyone in Intel who can fake handwriting? Fouché nodded. Got a few experts, Your Highness. Good. Get M over here. And find Versailles' letters. Joseph gestured toward the floor. Versailles. Fouché remembered he was a close friend of Vezanier's. He crouched down to start searching. A moment later, he held up a letter. Your Highness, found it. The handwriting experts arrived one by one. Under Joseph's direction, they studied Vezanier's and Versailles letters, then started churning out forgeries. Joseph picked the two best forgers and told them to find all of Versailles' correspondence and hand it over to the intel guys to analyze for coded messages or anything suspicious. When everything was ready, Joseph told Fouché, get me a few of our best men and send them to Cannes ASAP. Can? Joseph nodded. Dig into Versailles' background, then set things up like this. As he explained, Fouché caught on, his eyes lighting up. He nodded enthusiastically. Yes, sir. I'll get right on it. Joseph finalized the plan with Fouché, making sure every detail was covered. Then he left the intelligence office, feeling a lot lighter, and headed toward the police academy. He was definitely late for tactical command class. A few days later, on the left bank of Paris, inside a small villa on Rue Malfatard, a couple in their 40s sat in chairs looking miserable, lost in their own thoughts and sighing every few minutes. Stew, bread, and vegetable soup sat untouched on the table, cold and unappetizing. A knock at the door startled them. The maid peeked through the crack and asked, Who is it? Does Viscount Monterey live here? Speaking. The man stood up wearily and walked to the door, frowning at the stranger. Excuse me, who are you? Sylvain, it's me. The visitor clapped the Viscount on the shoulder, then, seeing his blank look, grinned. Langer, your cousin. Don't you remember? Cousin? Viscount Monterey was confused. Mr. Lang seemed a little offended. He handed Monterey a package. My mother is your Aunt Angelique. Remember her? Monterey's face cleared. Aunt Angelique. How is she? Dear cousin, how did you find me here? The so-called Lang was, of course, a plant from the police intelligence department. They'd scoped out Cannes, Monterey's hometown, and prepped everything carefully, choosing a distant relative as the point of entry. Lang pulled out a week-old copy of the Cannes news and showed it to Monterey. Saw the news about Runnake's nephew. Such a shame. The article covered the Runnake murder case that Vezanier was currently handling. Mrs. Monterey came over, covering her face with her hands, her eyes red. Even Ken knows about this. Lang jumped in. My mother saw the news and told me I had to help. So here I am. Oh, by the way, how's the case going? Any verdict yet? Viscount Monterey shook his head. Not yet. But the judge won't even see me. I'm afraid, there's no hope. Lang smiled and patted him on the back. That's why I'm here. You have an idea? Lang nodded. The man I work for now has some connections with the judge. I can help you out. Of course, it'll cost a pretty penny. A big one. The Monterey couple were so relieved they almost knelt. We'll find the money somehow. As long as he doesn't hang, anything else is fine. Please. Lang pulled them back into their chairs. Tell me everything about the case. After a long time, the Viscount Monterey recounted the details. Lang pressed for more details, then jumped to his feet. Okay, I'm heading to the High Court right now. Just wait for good news. 40 minutes later, Lang's carriage pulled up outside the side entrance of the Paris High Court. He glanced at the crowd of protesters in front and shook his head. He pushed through and squeezed inside. A short time later, he was in the largest office on the third floor, face to face with his target, Justice Vezanier. Chapter 93. Dig a hole, dig it bigger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lang gave Vezanier a formal bow, introduced himself, and handed him a letter. Vezanier checked the envelope seal, opened it slowly, and casually asked about the situation in Verrières. Since the police intelligence division had already gathered all the details, Lang was able to answer smoothly. Vezanier put on his glasses and began to read the letter. Verrières started by reminiscing about their past, then stated that Lang, the bearer of the letter, was his most trusted servant and could be Relied upon completely, Vezinir hadn't seen Verrières in years, but vaguely recalled a servant named Lang. He continued reading. Verrières explained that his cousin, Viscount Monterey, was involved in a lawsuit. He had seen the judge's name in the newspaper and, since it was an old friend, wanted to ask for a favor. As he wasn't feeling well enough to travel, he was sending his valet to Paris to handle things, and would visit as soon as the weather improved. He went on to ask Vezinir to try to get Runake a lighter sentence. The Monterey family was prepared to compensate him for his trouble and would make it worth his while, so, Monterey's relative was tied to Verrières via Vezinir. Vezinir put the letter away, looked at Lang, and said, "Of course, I'll help Victor. But this kid went too far. With witnesses, he's looking at whipping in 30 years, minimum." Lang nodded, nervously rubbing his hands. "Actually, my master was hoping for a not guilty verdict." Vezinir started to shake his head, but Lang's next words made him pause. "The Viscount de Monterey is willing to pay 35,000 livres. After a moment of silence, Vezinir sighed, "Dealing with the witness will be tricky. We'll take care of it." Vezinir turned away, waving his hand. "Go back for now. I'll give you an answer in a few days." That afternoon, when Vezinir got home, he immediately wrote a letter, sealed it, and summoned his trusted aide, Bruno, ordering him to deliver it to Verrières in Cannes as quickly as possible. Before Bruno left, the glassmaker in Vezinir's household tipped off the police intelligence officers watching the villa. Bruno rode without stopping for 2 days, finally arriving in Cannes. The small city had only one main road leading to Paris. Vendors lined the street, listlessly trying to attract customers. Bruno consulted a map, got out, and asked the nearest vendor for directions to the Viscount Valliers's home. Verrières was practically the deputy mayor of Cannes, everyone knew him. For 5 deniers, the vendor eagerly pointed the way. Bruno continued, stopping a young man near the city center for directions. The young man was about to answer when he saw a fight break out nearby and quickly fled. Bruno grabbed a passing middle-aged man, who gave him the same directions as the vendor. It was dusk when Bruno reached the Verrières family villa. A valet ushered him inside. Bruno noted the Verrières family crest on the wall and stair railing, making a mental note. Then, he saw the sick Viscount Verrières, bundled up in blankets, nodding from the 2nd floor. Bruno quickly gave the valet the letter, who carried it upstairs to Verrières. About half an hour later, Bruno received a reply from Viscount Verrières and rushed back to Paris that night. He didn't notice that the villa's gardeners and handymen looked suspiciously like the vendors along the road into Cannes. The maid who served him tea had been one of the fighters in the city center, now in women's clothing. The police intelligence department was short on female spies. As for the Verrières who greeted him, in the dim light and at that distance, a well-made-up impostor could have fooled Verrières' own mother. The real Verrières' house was actually a few miles away. When Bruno returned to Paris, he gave the reply to Vezinir, claiming he'd met Viscount Verrières and had tea at his home. It wasn't his fault. In this era of limited information, verifying someone's identity in a distant city was difficult. Even if he went to the city hall, the police intelligence department had already arranged for him to see Viscount Verrières from a distance. Vezinir, now fully convinced, summoned Longuet and told him he could try to get Runake off, but the case was big and would require 40,000 livres. Lang agreed, but hoped for a quick trial. The young nephew of Viscount Verrières, Runacher, was used to the finer things and couldn't handle prison life. Vezinir happily agreed. Lang returned to the Viscount of Monterey's house with the news. He then paid a doctor to provide a certificate, stating the witness in the Runake case was a mentally unstable alcoholic who beat his wife. The Monterey family mortgaged their villa and painting shop, scraping together everything they could, but only came up with about 30,000 livres. Lang reluctantly paid the remaining 6,500 livres out of his own pocket. Once everything was set, Lang repeatedly warned his cousin that, as family members of the accused, they should have no further contact with the judge, then took them outside the Vezinir's villa. The Viscount of Monterey handed the banknotes to Judge Vezinir's servant and saw the judge nod from the window. A huge weight lifted from his shoulders. Lang visited Vezinir that night, thanking him on behalf of his master and requesting a letter of confirmation to prove he had successfully completed his mission. Vezinir, flush with 40,000 livres, was in high spirits. He wrote a 3-page letter, detailing his efforts and reminding his old friend to remember the favor, and complimented the servant in passing. Lang left with the letter. A few days later, a messenger from Verrières delivered a thank-you letter from the master to Vezenier. The judge read the letter once and immediately burned it, telling the messenger to instruct Verrières to burn their latest correspondence as well. He had handled too many shady cases and knew the importance of destroying evidence. 5 days later, the Runnicher case resumed. First, the witness was declared mentally unstable, rendering his testimony invalid. Then, it was discovered that the so-called evidence found in Runnicher's house didn't belong to the deceased, a result of Vezenier's tampering. Chapter 94 Public Trial. Additional update for the boss: it's not good for the helmsman to be like T. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In court, the young lawyer representing the victim smiled, silently observing the judge's twisted interpretation of justice. Soon, amidst the anguished cries of the murdered siblings' parents, Judge Vezenier raised his gavel. This court finds Runnic not guilty of rape and murder, and he is acquitted. But as the gavel was about to fall, the young lawyer leaped to his feet. This verdict is illegal. You're making a mockery of the law. Vezenier shook his head, used to such outbursts from young hotheads. He sneered and gestured to the bailiffs. Remove this man. And get his name. He'll be charged with contempt of court. Unfazed, the lawyer declared, my name is Danton. George Jacques Danton. Sue me. He held up several sheets of paper. But first, Mr. Judge, perhaps you should explain these letters. Letters? What letters? Vezenier stared at the pages, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. His face paled. It looked like a letter he'd written to Verrières. How had it fallen into this lawyer's hands? The police intelligence department, of course, had provided the lawyer with the letter. Joseph had overheard Fouché mention that the victim's lawyer in the Runnicher case was a man named Danton. A quick check of the High Court's registered lawyers revealed only one Jacques Danton. This young lawyer, then, was the future Jacobin leader. Historically, Danton was known for his fierce sense of justice and powerful oratory, capable of inciting thousands to riot. Joseph had immediately decided to task him with finishing the Vezenier affair. Faced with such blatant injustice, Danton was sure to make waves. At the trial, Danton jumped onto a chair in the gallery and began reading aloud incriminating excerpts from Vezenier's letter. My dear old friend, I saw your man. But I need confirmation. Do you really want me to intervene in Runnic's case? As for the money, it's needed for greasing the wheels. You know, just for the evidence room, we need 10,000 livres. Destroying evidence is a serious crime. I'm not sure what they plan to do with the witness, but I swear, I can get your nephew acquitted as long as that damn carpenter keeps his mouth shut. Poor Runnic must be sick of that moldy, cold prison. Originally, he was headed for death row, or even the gallows. But don't worry, I'll spring him after the next session. Bailiffs. Stop him. Vezenier screamed, pointing at Danton. He's lying. Before the bailiffs could react, Vezenier, beside himself with rage, leaped over the table and charged at Danton, eyes bloodshot. Danton, however, nimbly dodged through the tables and chairs, continuing to read the letter as he went. By the time he'd finished the most damning parts, he'd reached the courtroom door, shoved aside the guard, and burst outside. A crowd of thousands had gathered outside the High Court, even larger than usual for protests. Marat, Desmoulins, and others had summoned them to support the trial. Danton ran to the iron fence of the court and yelled, that shameless scoundrel just spat on the law in front of us all. He acquitted a murderer. The crowd erupted in fury. Hang the murderer. Hang the corrupt judge, too. Hang them. They must hang. Danton signaled for silence and raised the letter. I have proof of the judge's corruption. I'll make sure he gets what he deserves. Several bailiffs tried to stop him, but intimidated by the thousands of angry people, they hesitated. A detachment of 30 police officers stood just a few steps away, ready to intervene if the bailiffs tried anything that would endanger Danton. Danton continued to shout, to prevent them from destroying the evidence, I propose we hold a public trial right here. The crowd roared its approval. Public trial. Let's watch the trial ourselves. Get out here, you judge who let the murderer go free. The angry crowd roared for an entire day, growing larger by the hour. Finally, at dusk, Chief Minister Brian appeared and publicly promised that the Royal Court of the Plenipotentiary would conduct a public hearing on the Vezinier bribery case in the square in front of the High Court. Only then did the crowd begin to disperse. At 11 o'clock that night, after repeatedly confirming that there were no protesters outside the court, Vezinier disguised himself in a coachman's clothes and slipped out the back door. Unbeknownst to him, the police intelligence department had been watching him all along. Vezinier's carriage had barely gone 2 blocks when someone shouted, "There he is! The judge who helped the murderer! Everyone, hurry! It's Vezinier!" Torches flared to life, and Marat, leading hundreds of people, dragged Vezinier from the carriage and began beating him without mercy. Nearby, dozens of police officers, sensing their cue, blew their whistles and moved to separate the crowd. After all, they couldn't let the mob kill him before he could be brought to trial. Vezinier lay on the ground, barely recognizable, twitching in a pool of blood. 2 days later, the Royal Court of the Plenipotentiary dispatched a judge to conduct a public hearing on the Vezinier case in front of the High Court. The Royal Court of the Plenipotentiary, controlled by the king, had once held significant authority before Louis XIV. Over time, power had shifted to the High Court, and it had become largely a ceremonial institution. The judges never imagined they'd actually preside over a real case, but with thousands of angry citizens watching, no one dared to question their qualifications. Vezinier, his leg broken, lay nearby, covered in bandages, moaning in pain. Danton presented the letters to the judge, claiming they were found at Vezinier's home. The judge immediately ordered a search, and a letter from Verrières was indeed found in his study. The correspondence corroborated the evidence, confirming that Vezinier had accepted bribes to exonerate Runnicher. Lying on a makeshift stretcher, Vezinier couldn't understand how the letters had reappeared after he'd burned them. In truth, Verrières had written 2 copies of her letters, one for Vezinier to burn, and another for her maid to secretly place in his study. The Monterey family was then called to testify. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the glares of the crowd, the couple confessed to bribing the judge. The Royal Court of the Plenipotentiary publicly declared Vezinier guilty of bribery, obstruction of justice, and destruction of evidence, sentencing him to 50 years in prison. Due to Vezinier's corruption, the court also announced that all previous cases he had presided over would be reviewed and retried. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Only Danton, Marat, and others seemed unmoved. They wanted only one verdict: hanging. Chapter 95: Adding Insult to Injury. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Several judges from the plenipotentiary court stepped aside, and the High Court judge, Count Vadier, cautiously approached, reread the verdict, signed, and sealed it. Since the plenipotentiary court lacked the authority to pass judgment, Vezinier's fate still hinged on further legal proceedings. At this point, Vezinier was officially convicted. A dissatisfied voice rose from the crowd of onlookers. They need the power to judge. The all-powerful court should have the power to judge. We can't let those corrupt judges judge us. The High Court always protects its own. Yeah. They're not qualified. They should be tried by a full court. A few voices quickly swelled into a chorus of thousands, the cry of judgment. Echoing in the air, Joseph had orchestrated the Royal Plenipotentiary Court's involvement, and those spearheading the call for judicial power were part of his plan. Joseph had put in a tremendous effort to crack the High Court's defenses. Now, he wanted to press his advantage, to utterly destroy this monster created by the aristocracy. Only after Vezinier was carried away and a plenipotentiary court judge assured the crowd that the matter of judicial power would be relayed to the king did the citizens quiet down. That afternoon, a pall hung over the High Court, yet everyone was frantically busy. The sheer number of cases Vezinier had overseen meant a massive workload of retrials. The entire court was consumed by the task. In a third-floor conference room, 5 key judges were voting on the new tax bill. "I'm in favor of registration," Debord said, raising his hand. Vadier raised his hand even faster than Judge Gretel from the Dubourg faction. I agree. The gruesome scars on Vezinier's body were still fresh in his mind. He just wanted this to be over, to return to his old life. Without Vezinier's interference, the 4 judges quickly approved the bill's registration. Only Louis, representing the old aristocracy, abstained, his face a thundercloud. A shaft of sunlight streamed through the conference room window, illuminating the text of the bill on the table. Dubourg glanced at the judges, then opened the document, shielded it from the sun with his left hand, and wrote approved for registration with his right, stamping it with the Paris High Court seal. The tax bill, delayed for a year, rejected repeatedly, costing a finance minister his job, and used by the aristocracy as a weapon against the royal family, was finally passed. Thanks to Joseph's careful maneuvering, the aristocracy's expansion of power and the monarchy's decline had been reversed. At the Palace of Versailles, Queen Mary, hearing that the tax bill that had plagued her for nearly a year had finally passed, was ecstatic. She immediately showered Brian with praise. Then, the plenipotentiary tribunal judges reported the protesters' demand for jurisdictional authority. The Queen, long disgusted with the High Court, seized the opportunity to vent her anger. She immediately signed the edict, granting the plenipotentiary court the power to hear all cases involving Vezinier. Although the nobles who learned of this were furious, none dared voice their objections. Vezinier was now the hottest topic. Anyone disagreeing would be branded an accomplice of the corrupt judge, destined for public scorn. They no longer controlled the narrative and couldn't sway public opinion. However, the Queen was also concerned about the month-long protests that had gripped the High Court. No ruler could ignore large-scale demonstrations. She ordered Brian to disperse the protesters and restore peace to Paris as quickly as possible. When Joseph heard about the edict, he felt a wave of relief. This would make the next steps much easier. He had expected to have to convince Brianna himself, given the Queen's indecisive nature, but she had acted decisively this time. Perhaps the passage of the tax bill had given her a subconscious boost of confidence. Now, with the plenipotentiary court applying pressure, the High Court should crumble. In the Crown Prince's drawing room, 3 judges of the plenipotentiary court sat respectfully on a sofa, listening attentively. They had gleaned from Archbishop Brian that their involvement with the High Court was due to the Crown Prince's intervention. Joseph smiled at them and asked, "What are your thoughts on the future of the plenipotentiary tribunal?" The judges exchanged glances. Besides advising the Palace of Versailles nobles, what else could it be? Joseph pressed on. If the Vezinier case goes well, it could set a precedent. In the future, trials involving judges, prosecutors, and so on could be handled by a full-power court. The 3 men's eyes lit up. The oldest judge seized the key point. "Your Highness, what would make a trial successful?" Joseph said solemnly, "Severely punish Vezinier and restore justice to those he wronged." "You mean, retry the cases he handled?" Joseph nodded. "Settle them quickly and hand down harsh sentences." After a quick glance at the case files, one of the judges asked, "Your Highness, many of these cases are from years ago, and a lot of evidence is missing." Joseph smiled coldly. Did Vezinier worry about evidence when he judged those cases? The oldest judge understood instantly, nodding. "Your Highness, we know what to do." Joseph reassured them, "Vezinier is a symbol of corruption. Everyone wants him punished immediately. No one will care about technicalities." The next day, Vezinier's public trial resumed in the square in front of the High Court. Victims of his unjust rulings arrived, many guided by Marat. As the trial began, the thousands of onlookers fell silent. To everyone's surprise, within half an hour, a 3-year-old case was overturned. The previously acquitted murderer was to be apprehended. Vezinier was charged with accepting bribes, harboring criminals, and tampering with evidence. The crowd erupted in cheers. The family members of the deceased in that case knelt, crying and making the sign of the cross. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription, monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. Chapter 96. Find you a father. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the judge of the plenipotentiary tribunal announced the verdict, a palace official displayed the king's order. the tribunal was now responsible for all cases involving Vezenier. The crowd erupted in cheers. The power to judge. The all-powerful court has the power to judge. Long live the king. Long live France. God bless the French people. Punish the shameless judge. High court judges watched from a nearby building. They would normally have condemned such interference, but they were forced to swallow their pride. The crowd outside was a powder keg. Anyone who dared question the tribunal's decision would be torn to shreds by the mob. Despite the hundreds of police officers present, the judges knew that they wouldn't lift a finger to help. The tribunal worked with impressive speed. In a single day, it overturned 6 old cases presided over by Vezenier. The victims wept tears of joy, shouting, "Thank God! And long live the king!" Many even fainted from the excitement. Vezenier's own crimes were forgotten in the frenzy. There were simply too many to count. The next day, the tribunal retried the remaining 11 cases tied to Vezenier. Originally, there were more, but some were minor or the files had vanished. The tribunal, eager to fulfill the Crown Prince's request for a swift resolution, conveniently overlooked them. 11 major cases would do just fine. In one particularly egregious case, Vezenier was suspected of murdering a witness in prison, framing the defendant in the process. The defendant's lawyer never raised an objection. At 4 p.m. that day, the presiding judge picked up the verdict, recited a litany of Vezenier's crimes, and declared, "The sentence is, beheading." The crowd exploded. Cheers and applause echoed for over 10 minutes. People ran through the streets of Paris to spread the news. Marat, perched on a nearby windowsill, jumped down, dusted off his pants, and scoffed, "Beheading? Humph! That scumbag deserves to be hanged." The guillotine, a less painful method of execution, was reserved for nobles, while commoners were hanged at the Paris Merchant newspaper office. Dennick, having received confirmation of the beheading, followed Joseph's prearranged instructions, grabbed the prepared manuscript, and ordered the presses to roll. The headline of the Paris Business Times blared, "The High Court has too much power. Who should supervise it?" News and pictures ran with High Court interference paralyzes government. Simultaneously, Marat, Desmoulins, and others were furiously writing articles, detailing Vezenier's crimes, dissecting the High Court's corruption, and praising the Royal Plenipotentiary Court. These articles were rushed to various newspapers. With the High Court in disarray and its news review agency defunct, the press was effectively unsupervised, allowing any news to be printed under this relentless barrage of public opinion. The High Court became the talk of Paris. The crowd protesting outside the courthouse dwindled, but nearly 100 people remained, demanding a thorough investigation of all the judges except Vezenier. The Vezenier case and the High Court's malfeasance were now the main topics of discussion even within the Palace of Versailles. After allowing public opinion to reach a fever pitch, Joseph and Brian went to see Queen Mary, ready to drive the final nail into the High Court's coffin. In the tea room, the Queen praised Brian. "Archbishop Brian, your hard work has given us hope for the country's finances. I must thank you for your efforts on the tax bill." She had seen Brian 3 times recently, and each time she found new ways to express her gratitude. She had been so frustrated by the bill previously. Brian bowed and said, "I am honored to serve France. The passage of this bill is largely thanks to the Crown Prince." The Queen smiled and nodded, assuming he was simply flattering her son. She believed her son had played a significant role, but at his young age, Brian must have been the mastermind. Joseph winked at Brian, who handed the Queen the bill. "Your Majesty, this is a new bill drafted by the Minister and His Royal Highness. We would value your opinion." Queen Mary took the document, opened it, and asked, "What's this about?" Brian explained, "The public recognizes the Royal Plenipotentiary Court's role in the Vezenier case. We believe it can effectively supervise the High Court and prevent future abuses." Queen Mary skimmed the bill, noting that it granted the Plenipotentiary Court the authority to oversee the High Court, including the power to search, review, prosecute, and judge its actions. It also proposed renaming the court the Royal Court of Supremacy to underscore its position as the High Court Superior. Furthermore, the bill stipulated that the High Court would relinquish its control over the News Review Agency, allowing it to focus solely on judicial matters. Queen Mary couldn't help but smile. The High Court had been a thorn in her side for too long, and the thought of a higher authority overseeing it was music to her ears. However, she expressed a concern, Archbishop Brian, this bill must be registered by the High Court. How can we expect them to agree to this? Joseph smiled, sign the bill, and I guarantee the High Court will pass it. The Queen looked at her son, then at Brian, and seeing their confidence, she signed her name and had the clerk take it to Louis XVI for his signature and seal. Paris Superior Court. In a conference room on the third floor, 5 key members of the court stared at the bills before them, their faces grim. This bill was a noose around the High Court's neck. The Royal Court of Plenipotentiary, now the Royal Court of Supremacy, held the other end. A simple tug would be enough to suffocate them. Justice Loault, a man with a hooked nose, slammed his fist on the table and hissed, this bill will never be registered. Chapter 97. A lot of pressure. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dubourg sighed, not arguing with Louault. They were united against the Supreme Court, but the situation had more power than they did. He glanced towards the door. The Supreme Court's representative was in the next room. He shook his head, nobody wants to end up like Count Vezinir. Before he could finish, several dignitaries and congressmen visibly winced. Someone from the Supreme Court had just delivered a message. In response to the public outcry in Paris, His Majesty the King was considering retrying all major cases handled by the High Court in recent years. There was systemic corruption in the High Court. Any judge there was bound to be dirty, their hands were as dirty as Vezinir's. And they couldn't stop the retrial. Paris was a powder keg. All it would take was for someone from the Supreme Court to yell, and thousands would surround the court, just like with Vezinir. After a moment, Dyball raised his hand weakly, and said gravely, register it. His situation differed from the other judges. The Supreme Court had told him they'd fully support him as president of the High Court after the bill passed. That was Joseph's signal. When dealing with an opponent on their last legs, you had to divide and conquer. So, for Dubourg, even though the High Court's power would be severely curtailed, his personal power would be compensated with the presidency, which he could reluctantly accept. Judge Waitier sighed and raised his right hand, I agree. Let's just get it over with. Gretel and Aurel had no choice but to follow suit. Just like that, the judges held their noses and passed the bill giving the Crown Court oversight of the High Court. They barely even noticed the clause stripping the High Court of its power over news censorship. What did a few stray hairs matter when the cow was already dead? Surprisingly, this important bill barely caused a ripple in aristocratic circles. The nobles didn't seem to care if the High Court remained or not. Oh, another royal court. Wasn't that just the old royal plenipotentiary court, which had been around for centuries? In stark contrast to the nobles' indifference, the common people of Paris were ecstatic. The years of resentment against the High Court were now being vented on Vezinir. For days, shouts echoed in the streets, long live the king, long live the plenipotentiary court. Execute the corrupt judges, especially Vezinir's victims, who praised the king's benevolence and wisdom, and the plenipotentiary court's just punishment of the villains. Soon, under the leadership of the Paris merchant, articles like His Majesty the Great King's Glorious Victory and His Majesty the King's Just Judgment appeared in Paris newspapers. For the first time, public opinion about the royal family was turning positive. Versailles Palace. Joseph wasn't surprised the Supreme Court bill had passed. Given the current climate, the High Court had no choice, but the thought of the High Court's diminished power was a relief. He could finally stretch his legs and tackle more important things. Speaking of important things, the looming famine flashed in his mind, making him dizzy again. France had over 20 million people, and a 30% food shortage was a terrifying prospect. And he remembered the shortages would last until early 1790. Joseph watched the falling snow outside the tall arched window. It was the end of snow month, mid-January by the Gregorian calendar, 6.5 months until the famine hit hard in July. Where would they get that much food? He had some ideas, but the closer he got to the problem, the more inadequate they seemed. Buying from abroad would require massive funds. France's current finances couldn't afford that much food. Storing so much grain required storage facilities, and measures to prevent theft during the worst times. Based on what he'd learned about the grain market, foreign purchases alone wouldn't fill the gap, that was assuming the grain market remained stable. If profiteers got involved, the gap would be even bigger. As for preventing hail, records showed hail as big as fists that year. Short of equipping dealers with steel armor, it was impossible. Joseph considered France's financial situation. He hadn't dealt with finances before, so it wasn't so obvious, but now the 2 billion plus debt felt like a crushing weight on his chest. Even selling off the Paris Angels he'd worked on for so long would only bring in 10 million livres, at most. 200 Paris Angels to plug that hole. He took a deep breath to ease the pressure. To solve the debt problem, they had to rely on the Industrial Revolution. The massive industrial output could generate huge profits, directly addressing the financial crisis. The Industrial Revolution would also significantly increase national strength, leading to greater gains in wars and overseas colonies, which would then fuel industry in a positive feedback loop. The United Kingdom faced a similar debt crisis in the early 19th century, just as dire as France is today. But they leveraged the Industrial Revolution to overcome it. Despite their huge debts, Joseph sipped his warm tea. To promote industry, he first needed control of industrial policy. He shook his head. France didn't even have a Ministry of Industry. The Minister of the Interior handled it. Monod was the last person who could successfully launch the Industrial Revolution. Fortunately, he'd acquired a few more cards recently. He could try to reason with Monod, get him to relinquish control of industry. That night, there was always a ball at Versailles. Joseph bravely navigated through the crowd, finally squeezing next to Monod, and quickly pulled him aside. The young women assumed the crown prince was about to ask someone to dance, but were surprised to see him grabbing the Minister of the Interior's arm, their faces etched with strange expressions. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription, monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. Chapter 98. Don't bully the old and the poor. Asking for monthly ticket. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Monod watched the warblers glare at him and gave Joseph an embarrassed bow. Your Highness, aren't you going to dance? Joseph replied, I don't have time for dancing. I need to talk to you about something important. Monod glanced at the dancers around them. Here. You want to talk business here? Joseph thought, I'd rather be relaxing with a cup of tea on the sofa, but after searching for you all afternoon, even your servants were clueless. I was looking for you this afternoon. Oh. Monod touched his nose, embarrassed. He didn't want anyone finding out about his little rendezvous with Countess Versailles. He quickly pulled the crown prince to a more secluded spot. Please, tell me what's on your mind. Joseph paused, then said, basically, I want to push for industrial development. Right now, your home office handles that. Monod blinked, nodding slightly. To be blunt, I want you to give up control over industry. Monod nodded again, waiting to hear what he'd get in return. Joseph continued, news reviews are no longer under the High Court's thumb. I think we should create a press and publication bureau to handle all that, and you can be in charge. Also, I've spoken with Archbishop Brian about implementing a patent law. He briefly explained the patent law, adding, we'll need a patent office to go with it. That could also be under your purview. Monod did some quick mental math. French industry was a joke compared to Britain's, barely alive. There was no real benefit to holding on to it. This patent office idea, though, that could be interesting. Getting involved with fashion design or something like that could be lucrative. As for news reviews, seems kind of pointless. He put on his most innocent, agreeable smile. Your Highness, about this. Joseph cut him off. And a printing shop. A shop? I have a technology that can cut picture printing costs to a fifth of what they are now. We can invest 200,000 livres. Of course, most of that will be your investment, but you'll have a near monopoly on printing in Paris. You and I each get 20% of the shares, and the Press and Publication Bureau gets 60%. You get all the profits for the first 7 years. Asterisk the printing shop Joseph wanted was really a means of controlling pamphlets, asterisk anyone who wanted to publish would have to come to me, or face ridiculously high prices. And if they came to me, well, this printing shop is tied to the Press and Publication Bureau. They'd have to pass the review first, after confirming the cheap printing technology was ready to go, Mono beamed. Oh, Your Highness, you're too generous. God bless you. In the royal workshop, King Louis XVI, exhausted from the day, set down the musket he'd been working on. He wiped his brow and prepared for dinner. As servants took off his apron, he grabbed the newspaper. Servants always brought the most important ones. His eyes landed on a headline, His Majesty's Glorious Victory. He scratched his head. He'd spent the day in the workshop, making guns. When had he achieved a glorious victory? He grabbed another paper. The front page read, His Majesty brings justice to loyal Paris. Louis XVI put on his glasses and read carefully. He finally understood the Royal Supreme Court bill he'd signed 2 days ago. He set down the paper, puffed out his chest, and thought, handling national affairs isn't so hard after all. I'm doing a pretty good job, aren't I? Outside the gilded doors of the East Palace Conference Hall at Versailles, Joseph, in a burgundy suit, puffed out his chest. He walked between 2 rows of guards who bowed in salute and strode into the hall. He couldn't remember being this eager to get in here. Soon, all the cabinet ministers had arrived. Queen Mary had even arrived early. Everyone bowed. The gilded doors creaked shut. The cabinet meeting was officially underway. Archbishop Brian looked around, grinning, and launched into the tax bill. Passing this bill will greatly alleviate the country's financial woes. He opened his prepared documents. The land tax alone is expected to increase revenue by 18 million livres annually. Stamp duties should add. After his long presentation, he glanced at Sumillard, who looked grim, and concluded, in total, these taxes will increase annual revenue by 22 to 24 million livres. Queen Mary applauded and nodded. This will be a historic day for French finances. Whether pleased or not, all the ministers applauded and congratulated Brian. After the tax bill, Brian swapped documents, bowed to the Queen, and announced, Now, let's move to the first item. Count Mono has suggested that Count Sumillard is responsible for the judicial scandal and is no longer fit to serve as Minister of Justice. Sumillard lowered his head, glanced at Mono, then stared at the brass pen holder, saying nothing. He knew the Versailles incident was too big. As Minister of Justice, he'd be held accountable for the lack of oversight, plus, he'd impeached Briand in the past. Briand wouldn't miss this chance for revenge. The Duke of Orleans knew Sumillard would be impeached and was ready to fight for his political ally. He stood, cleared his throat, and said, Your Majesty, as far as I know, Versailles was extremely discreet when taking bribes. Outsiders wouldn't have noticed. While Sumillard may have been negligent, is it really necessary to dismiss a cabinet minister over one judge? Joseph scoffed. The Duke of Orleans is truly eloquent. First, Versailles didn't just take bribes. Read his verdicts. Second, I suspect Versailles isn't the only problem in the High Court. How about we investigate further? He didn't care about destroying the High Court. It was just a playground for the aristocracy anyway. Tearing it down would make it easier for him to rebuild it. The Duke of Orleans turned red but didn't dare to answer. To avoid an investigation, the High Court members had already confessed to the Royal High Court. If he kept pushing, he'd become the enemy of all the judges. Seeing this, Briand pushed the dismissal document in front of Queen Mary and said respectfully, Your Majesty, please make your decision. Seeing the ministers in agreement, the Queen comforted Sumillard and signed the document. Briand collected the papers, looked at Sumillard, raised his hand, and gestured toward the door. Count Sumillard, please leave. Chapter 99 A meeting belonging to the Crown Prince. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sumillard felt a wave of humiliation wash over the entire conference hall. He was shaking with rage, but he had no choice but to stand and storm out, face like thunder. Once the gilded doors swung shut, Queen Mary sighed and turned to Brian. Archbishop Brian, she asked, who do you think is best suited to succeed the Minister of Justice? Brian responded immediately, Your Majesty, Baron Breteuil, the current palace advisor, is both capable and loyal. He studied law at the University of Paris. He'd be an excellent Minister of Justice. This was the result of careful consideration between Joseph and Brian. Breteuil was a skilled communicator with strong political abilities. Most importantly, he was the king's cousin and fiercely loyal to the royal family. He even stood by Louis XVI, planning his escape from Paris during the most dangerous moments, never betraying him. Queen Mary nodded. Have him meet with me later, please. Of course, Your Majesty. Joseph subtly glanced at Foreign Minister Vergennes. He was the next target. Removing Vergennes would be like defanging the Duke of Orleans, that old snake. Brian picked up the document again. The second matter. Given that the High Court has relinquished its power to censor news, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince proposes establishing a press and publication bureau to manage news censorship. The Duke of Orleans scoffed quietly, lowering his head, a dark look on his face. He'd been utterly defeated in the recent pamphlet war, and now, having lost the right to censor news, his hopes of controlling public opinion were dashed. In the past 20 minutes, he'd lost a key political ally and seen his control over public opinion crumble. Today's cabinet meeting was nothing short of a nightmare for him. Excellent, Queen Mary said, clearly pleased. Ever since she married into the French royal family, she'd been relentlessly slandered in the press. Today, she could finally see a change. Brian nodded towards Mono. The responsibilities of the Press and Publication Bureau fall closest to internal affairs, so I suggest Count Mono be put in charge. Mono immediately bowed, flattering the Queen. Your Majesty, I will ensure that those vulgar and shameless articles disappear from the face of the earth. Queen Mary smiled, pleased, praised Mono briefly, and quickly signed the document. Brian continued, the third matter. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has submitted a report, asserting that the Treaty of Eden has significantly damaged France's interests, particularly in the textile and steel industries, which are struggling to survive. Therefore, His Highness suggests that UK-France trade negotiations should restart as soon as possible, with the aim of revising the treaty's terms to prevent further deterioration. The Duke of Orleans sensed an opportunity to strike back. Your Highness, I'm afraid you're being naive. Britain has profited greatly from the treaty. Why would they agree to change it? Joseph shot him a glance, then bowed to the Queen. Your Majesty, I am absolutely certain I can convince the British. Before she could respond, he added, even if negotiations fail, we should still try. We have nothing to lose. All the cabinet ministers, except the Duke of Orleans and including Vergennes, immediately agreed. Several were either Joseph's allies or had vested interests, so of course they would. Queen Mary nodded slightly. Archbishop Brian, have you prepared specific terms for negotiation? Brian placed a document before her. Yes, Your Majesty. These are our established negotiation goals. The core is twofold. First, we aim to get the UK to reduce import tariffs on alcohol, including wine, beer, and spirits, to below 10%. The ministers, hearing the details of the negotiation for the first time, were immediately enthusiastic. Alcohol, especially wine, was a major French export, but it faced intense competition from Spain, Tuscany, Venice, and other regions. If the UK were to lower import tariffs solely on French wine, its competitiveness would increase substantially. Brian continued. The second point is to increase our import tariffs on industrial goods to 25%, then gradually reduce them by 3% each year until they reach 5% in 7 years. The foreign minister immediately objected. 5%? Absolutely not. That will completely strip French industry of any protection. Joseph smiled. Even with the current 12% tariff, our industry can't compete with the British. It's better to let those workshops catch their breath and transition to other industries sooner rather than later, minimizing losses. Besides, only by significantly lowering tariffs on industrial goods can we convince the British to lower tariffs on alcohol. Naturally, He wouldn't mention the rapid improvements in France's industrial capabilities, not with Orleans sitting right there. The Queen looked at Brian, hesitant. "Archbishop, do you agree?" "Yes, Your Majesty. This is the most beneficial path for us at the moment." Brian was actually unsure, but trusting the Crown Prince, he chose to support the terms. Other negotiations include Britain and France jointly forming a combined fleet to combat smuggling. Everyone was stunned, thinking they'd misheard. Britain and France, a combined fleet. It sounded unbelievable. This was the effect Joseph wanted. The British would see it as France conceding maritime dominance, and cracking down on smuggling would benefit France greatly. British industrial goods smuggled into France every year were crippling French industry because they effectively had zero tariffs, making them much cheaper than French-made products. If this clause was negotiated, it would essentially be using the British fleet to protect French industry. Britain gets bragging rights, and France gets a boost, a win-win situation. Brian continued, there's also a requirement for Britain to sell 1 million pounds of cheap wool to the port of Le Havre every year. Since France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, it had lost many overseas colonies, leading to a wool shortage that hampered the textile industry. Joseph wasn't sure if the British would be that generous, but after agreeing to a combined fleet, they should show some goodwill. If they couldn't spare 1 million pounds, at least 500,000. After discussing trade negotiations, Brian moved on. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince proposes introducing patent law and company law. Because the capital aristocracy urgently needed these two bills to develop industrial businesses, and they wouldn't harm the old aristocracy or common people, Queen Mary signed the document quickly and ordered it to be sent to the king for his signature. As for the High Court, they had no grounds to reject the two bills. Even if they did, under the watchful eyes of the Royal High Court, they could only register the bills obediently, thanks to Mr. Gongman, a small official, for the generous reward of 1,500 starting coins for this book. The young author is grateful. Moi. Chapter 100 Meeting a Thief at Night. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After a morning of grueling cabinet meetings, several ministers looked beat. Queen Mary was about to call for a lunch break when Brian jumped the gun. One last thing. The Queen sighed inwardly, her butt, which had just lifted off the chair, plopped back down. Brian looked at Mono. Count Mono feels we should set up dedicated teams to turn around the textile, steel, and glass industries, given their current slump. Too tired to think, Queen Mary went straight to the Prime Minister. Brian, what's your take? This had been hashed out before. Brian jumped in. Your Majesty, I propose an industrial planning bureau to handle those industries. That way, Count Mono can focus on news review. The Queen, seeing it as no big deal, nodded. And who do you think should head it up? Joseph, ready for this, stood up. Your Majesty, I'll take it on. It'd be a good learning experience. Palais Royal, the Duke of Orleans looked at the British ambassador to France, utterly confused. You've already talked trade negotiations with the Crown Prince? Indeed, Hartley said with a smile. And you know what he proposed at the cabinet meeting? The Duke of Orleans smirked. He wants the UK to drop the tariff on French wine to under 10%. He's pulling our leg. Hartley hesitated. Your Majesty, the British Parliament has agreed to it in principle and asked me to set up a negotiation date as soon as possible. The Duke of Orleans was stunned. How could you agree to those terms? Just then, a guard shouted outside the door, get him. He went that way. Someone, block the corridor. Damn, he's slippery as a squirrel. Ah. Watch out. He's deadly with a sword. The butler yanked the door open, quickly locked it, and told the Duke of Orleans, Sir, a thief got in. The guards are cornering him. You're safe here. The Duke of Orleans frowned, though he wasn't surprised. With so many people coming and going, it was easy for a thief to slip in. He was curious though, with all the commotion, why hadn't the guards caught the guy? Soon, a guard knocked and entered, out of breath, and reported to the butler, the latter turned to the Duke of Orleans. "Sir, it looks like the thief stole something from your document room and bolted from the royal palace." "That damn crook." Orleans' face darkened. The document room held sensitive stuff, and it was heavily guarded. How could a thief manage that? He ordered, "Send more men and catch him." "Yes, sir." Quickly, over 100 armed guards poured out of the royal palace and vanished into the twilight. 5 carriages sped along the cobblestone of Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris. This was the Crown Prince's mobile office. Joseph realized that running the industrial portfolio meant he had too much to do. Commuting between Paris and Versailles was wasting time, so he bought a place in the Louvre area as the French Industrial Planning Bureau headquarters. Moving his stuff and settling in the carriage, Joseph was brainstorming ways to score a big food fund fast. He'd roughly calculated that, at a 30% shortfall, even without price hikes, they'd need to buy at least 60 million livres worth of food just to scrape by in 1788, that didn't include building granaries or covering losses, and 1789. Forget about buying food abroad. It was a global climate mess, with widespread famines from Europe to Asia. If he couldn't fix the food shortage, the hungry would take things into their own hands. Joseph first considered a loan, but the French government's credit was shot. Borrowing that much fast would be tough. And the interest would be outrageous. Next, public bonds. Nah, the finance minister had already sold off all the ones worth selling, trying to strike it rich with new tech. Not enough time to make that kind of money. He needed to make quick money, big money. Lost in thought, he heard gunfire in the distance, then yelling, and the carriage slowed down. A guard reported outside the window, "Your Highness, looks like they're chasing a thief up ahead." Chasing a thief? With that much gunfire? Joseph was surprised. A whole gang? "No, Your Highness," said the guard. "Just one guy, they say." "One guy causing that much trouble?" Joseph asked. "Is it the cops doing the arresting?" That the guard shook his head. "Royal Palace Guards, Your Highness." "The Duke of Orleans?" More gunshots rang out. Emin quickly told the driver to back up and steer clear of the trouble. As the convoy turned into a side street, a figure in black dropped from a rooftop on the right. The figure braced against the building, slowing his descent. Spotting the passing carriage, he smashed a window and leaped inside. He steadied himself on the small wooden table in the carriage. In the candlelight, he saw only 2 people, one a young guy who looked harmless. He moved fast. Feet planted, he whipped out a knife and lunged at the blonde guy. He didn't intend to kill anyone, just grab a hostage to bargain his way out. But before the blade was even an inch away, the man in front of him flashed a small sword, holding it against the figure's throat. The blonde guy said grimly, "Don't move, or you're dead." The figure froze. The blonde guy snatched away the knife. "Guard!" The blonde guy started to call out, but the young guy stopped him and asked the intruder, "Was it Royal Palace Guards chasing you?"